a speaker series, Resources for Building Resiliency During Uncertain Times. This is led by the 2020 Jefferson Civic Leadership Academy and sponsored by the Jefferson Educational Society. I want to make sure everyone knows that today's session is being recorded and it will be archived on the Jefferson Educational Society website. Today's session is going to be strategies for de-escalation and improving mental health. Our last session will be in 1 week on February 2nd, and that will be Small Business Resiliency Toolkit, Preparedness Plans, and Human Resources. Today, we're joined by Dr. Mandy Fauble. She's the Director of Clinical Care Services at UPMC Western Behavioral Health and Safe Harbor, which is located in Erie, Pennsylvania. Her areas of focus are persistent mental health, trauma, and crisis intervention. She's the project director of both federal and state grant projects addressing the opioids epidemic's impact on women and families in Erie, Venango, and Crawford counties. She's the faculty member at Mercyhurst University and has been since 2002. She's also an assistant professor at the Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania and has been since 2012. She's additionally a certified trainer of applied suicide training and question, persuade, and refer. Mandy will be speaking today on de-escalation strategies and techniques to achieve or maintain good mental health. Questions can be asked throughout her presentation, and you can put them in the comments on Facebook. Okay, Mandy, I'm going to have you take it away, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. And all I can say is I'm super glad to get through the painful part where, you're talking about all of the things that you were talking about. So let's see here. I think you should be able to see my slides, right? Randalee, can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, good. So we are already in business. That's great. And I do want to reiterate, I love to have questions really at any time, and we have a system worked out for that. So we want to encourage people that if you want to participate, we want to hear from you. So I would personally love to have that experience. So we are going to talk about strategies for de-escalation and improving mental health. And anyone who has sort of been in a tough situation, so 100% of us, you know that we could probably talk about conflict resolution and de-escalating situations for years. We could have a lot of talk about that, and we could have a lot of talk about improving mental health, but we're going to try to distill a lot of this into what are some critical takeaways. So for me, I approach this with just thinking about, okay, I have 60 minutes. What are the things that I would most want to impart for folks? The very first thing that I'm going to say before we start, though, is that the focus of this presentation is on the things that we can control and what we can do. And so sometimes because of that, it can almost make it seem that if a person is struggling with a mental health concern, that it's somehow their fault. Or if they are in a tough situation with someone and that person elevates and there's a conflict, that it's somehow your fault. And I think I just want to set the stage right away by saying that sometimes we do everything that we can in our power, and we need to reach out to other people to help us with maybe it's our mental health concerns, or we need to reach out to get help in maybe a scary situation that we can't de-escalate, and that's okay. So a part of how to think about that is understanding that sometimes the thing that we can do is reach out to others for help too. But we want to go into this thinking that it's not blame or shame. It's just talking about what are the things that we can do to improve in these areas. So we're breaking this into two sections. And the first section is really kind of thinking about yourself and building your resilience and thinking about how can you become more self-aware of who you are and how you cope with stress, who you are and how your personal style of communication might influence very heavily what a conflict looks like. And then once we talk a little bit about ourselves, we'll transition into thinking about, well, how do we bring ourselves into engaging other people and diffusing situations? And we'll talk about some common methods that we know do actually help a lot in de-escalating situations. We'll talk about sort of knowing when to pay attention to recognizing that a situation is starting, the temperature is starting to rise. And then we'll also talk about what are ways to prevent and reduce escalation once we start to see it happening. So again, we're starting with ourselves here. And what I hear from most people is that they themselves have the toughest time communicating when they are in crisis. We'll talk about why that is. We also have a very hard time sometimes communicating with other people when they're escalated. And we'll also talk about why that is. And so, of course, when these two people come together, what we have is sometimes conflict. So that can be really challenging. And for a lot of us, conflict is hard because we sometimes misunderstand it. You know, we take anger very personally, or we think the person's angry with us, and really it's a situational thing. Or maybe we were not in a situation growing up where we learned how to handle conflict appropriately, or it hurts our feelings. There are all kinds of things that conflict brings up for a lot of us that can make it very challenging for us to work through it. So we'll sort of touch base on how to make it a little bit easier. So the first thing is sort of starting with, like, how do you come in as prepared as possible? And when I'm suggesting, you know, that our ability to handle crises and our ability to handle day-to-day things can be sort of tripped up by tough situations, what that really speaks to is a need to think first and foremost about what are you bringing in? So think about this as like, if you are going to the gym to work out, what are you wearing? You know, are you wearing the things that help to promote a good workout? Here, we're kind of thinking about, well, if we're coming into a conversation about how to handle mental health or our own mental health and wellness, or how to handle other people, this is like asking ourselves, well, are we bringing our best selves? Are we ready for our workout? You know, and so these are all things that we know really work. And what I've nicknamed here the big five, sometimes we see these in the literature as the big five. We know that sleep is hugely predictive of the stress response. So we actually do know that for people that don't sleep enough or they have disrupted sleep, that sleep can trigger anxiety. Sleep can actually, lack of sleep can trigger a problem with our immune system. So there are all kinds of things associated with sleep. Same with our diet, same with exercise. Everyone probably online has heard that exercise is a really, really important part of staying well. That's true. It also is a really important part of coping with stress. What does our internal dialogue look like? So we've all heard that probably example of, you know, do we wake up and say, oh, good God, it's morning? Or do we wake up and say, oh, I'm so glad that I woke up this morning? You know, like how we start our day, how we talk about this, you know, are we in traffic white knuckled, like, I'm going to be late, I'm going to be late, I'm going to be late? Or is our internal dialogue like, well, I might be 5 minutes late, it'll probably be okay. Or, oh, next time I'll get up a little bit earlier. How we talk to ourselves about what's happening really dictates how what's happening goes. Finally, another important part of the big five is the experience of joy and mastery. So we actually know that your mental wellness will be better if you do things that bring you joy. And also if you do things that give you a sense of self-control and of competence. So if you even look around at some of these bullet points, some people love gardening because they feel that sense of control. They like to look and weed the garden. I wish that my workday could look like a beautifully finished weeded garden. Or humor, you know, sometimes that just gives us a sense of joy. So on this list, you see formal things, right? Like for some people, an important part of coping is taking an antidepressant medication, or an important part of coping is seeing a therapist, but it could also be going to the movies, making sure we're playing with our kids. The important thing here is that this is very subjective. But the bottom line is that healthy coping skills are things that we don't regret, and things that we do actually feel refreshed, and we feel a sense of renewal when we do these types of activities. Now, Randalee, I thought I saw a little flash in the chat box. Did I?
You did. We did have a question regarding what you can control and what you can't. I think someone was looking for examples of things that you are not able to control.
Oh, okay. So I'm really glad that a person felt comfortable asking that. So something that you can't control, for instance, is if a person is mad at you. You might be able to, so if I come home and let's just say I've left my clothes on the floor, and the person I live with, not that I would ever do that, wink, wink, and the person I live with is angry and says, you left your clothes on the floor. I have a choice, right? Like I can't control that that person is maybe upset with me, and I can't control what they're thinking in that moment or what they're doing in that moment, but what I can control is how I might respond. So I could respond with, oh yeah, well you, right? And then probably what's going to happen, but whoosh, right? Or I could respond with, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I left the house in such a rush, I didn't even notice. So we can control what we bring back to that situation, and certainly what we bring back influences what happens, but we can't ultimately control other people. Or another example is if someone you love dies. I mean, that's the reality. We lose people in our lives. We can't control that, but we can control the ways that we choose to try to manage through what that experience is going to be like for us. So hopefully that helps. And if it didn't, I just want to see more of that chat, because I thought that was a great question. And so whoever posed that, thank you so much for it. So in the same vein, when we think about coping and we think about, again, like what are we bringing into that like exercise ring with us as we're approaching difficult situations, you may have heard of this theme of resilience. And so what is resilience? It is our bounce back. So resilience is the thing that helps us when we fail our driver's license for the first time to try again. Resilience is the thing that when we have a difficult breakup, we're like bottomed out, but we eventually decide that we're going to try it again. So resilience it's very powerful, and everyone has resilience. It's necessary to survive. This is not you're either a resilient person or you're not, but really resilience is on a spectrum. Every person has some, and there are like specific ways that you can build it. And so I want to tell people that, because I think just imagine if your inner dialogue tells you that you're strong, and not only does it tell you that you're strong, but it tells you you can be stronger, right? So like, how cool is that? And so the ways that we promote resilience are reducing stressors that we can. And so this is, again, it's back to like, what can you control? And so I often use the example of running behind, because that's something just to share with you, I sometimes run into with in my own life. If I'm running behind, my inner dialogue is like, I'm a wreck up there. So I know though, what I can control is how I'm talking to myself even. And what I have noticed is that if I say to myself, like, this is probably going to be okay, I feel better. Or sometimes maybe some of you are like me, and when you're tired, you're a little bit more reactive or you're cranky. I sometimes ask myself, actually, well, are you tired? Like, why are you having this response to that? That self-talk is extremely helpful in reducing our stress, either through managing it or just by eradicating it to the best of our ability. Now, remember, the key to this, though, is to start with things that are like sort of small and basic and doable. So this is like literally hey, can you get up 5 minutes earlier to make your workday start better? It's not the complicated, like, oh, can you get up 2 hours earlier and do an exercise routine and cook yourself a full breakfast? And we don't want to start there, because that actually tends to add more stress to people when they're trying to do all these like complex things. Start small and build from there. The other thing is to build your coping skills and resources. Ask yourself, what have you been through in your life? But don't stop there. Ask yourself, what'd you do to get through it? And what worked for you? And was it really effective? Sometimes we get through things by doing things that we think are effective at the time, but then when we really look at it, we find out they're not. Ask yourself, if you think it worked for you, why do you think it worked? How can you use it in other circumstances? So this is like any other skill that you have. We want to understand our skill and think about how to generalize it to other situations. So you can see that the first two are kind of about reducing our stress and then also building our skill set and even leaning in a little bit. And this last one is again about increasing the positive. So I am just going to keep reiterating this, that experiences of joy, something as simple as like Randalee petting her cat, or watching a 30-second clip of The Office that you love, anything, a fake laugh, a fake smile actually helps your body to fight stress, anxiety, and depression. It's very, very powerful. We also know that doing things that help you feel competent. We all love to feel confident. We all love to feel competent, like we know what we're doing, we're good at something. And so it could, again, be the little things. It could be putting together that huge, Harry Potter Lego set. It could be the gardening. It could be fixing a lawnmower. The things that help you realize you're capable are very important to continue to do, even if it's only for you, even if it's that you make the best bed with the tightest corners on the sheets and you're the only person that will see it. Doing those things that help you feel in control are really important. And I'll just reiterate, a big part of that is, are we also noticing that up here, playing that tape that tells us that we're competent and confident people. So we build ourselves up. A big piece of promoting wellness is also promoting ourselves in healthy ways. So I also want to just talk a little bit more about stress inoculation. Stress is a thing. I think we all know that. With the pandemic, what we're hearing are reports of significantly escalating anxiety, depression for people. We're hearing significantly increased suicidal thoughts. We're all under so much stress. So what can we do to further inoculate against it? The first is to become as self-aware as possible. Ask ourselves, what's causing the stress? To be honest, sometimes the stress is that we're telling ourselves that we're stressed. We're compounding it. Ask ourselves, how much of it is the event versus how much of it is like what we're reacting to? Pardon me. So, we've all known people that when they've had a divorce, they've had a party. And then we know people that when they've had a divorce, they were devastated. It's so important to understand stress is not just about the event itself. Stress is also about our response to it. Think again about your self-awareness. How much of the things that weigh on you, just think about this for a second. The things that weigh on you daily, how much of those things are about things that you can control versus things that you really can't control or you can't change. And if you don't change how you're reacting to it, nothing will change. So that's really, it's important. Many family conflicts, many relationship conflicts actually have their origins here, that people want to control or change other people. And they're looking outside when really we also need to start on the inside. Anticipate and prepare for stressors. What gets you going? So again, are you a person that if you're not getting a lot of sleep, you're probably going to be a wreck? Well, then can you think about how to get more sleep? If you know that you don't like to feel disrespected and you're going to have to talk to someone who disrespects you, how can you think about preparing for that conversation ahead of time to go in with your best coping skills at the ready? Lean in, practice, the concept of stress inoculation, just like our vaccines. There's so much conversation about vaccines. We can all relate to this, that part of this is you sort of give yourself doses to make yourself stronger. You lean into the thing that threatens your wellness a little bit so that you can hone those skills and you really then learn from those experiences. What we actually know, particularly about stress and anxiety, is that they feed on avoidance. So you can see at the bottom of my slide here, I wrote, anxiety loves avoidance, and that's true. More than anything, anxiety can really be escalated by avoiding the things that make us anxious, whereas leaning in actually teaches both our mind and our body that we can confront those things and come out on the other side stronger. So we're going to take this. So I want to just capture where we are right now. Where we are right now, we have talked a little bit about, the reality of stress. We've talked about coping skills and kind of thinking about like what works for you. We've talked about resilience and how to build resilience. And we've talked about stress inoculation and how to get ourselves stronger. So we've spent a lot of time, again, thinking about as we go into difficult situations, how do we build ourselves up? What we are going to transition into is also starting to think about what do we like when we're with other people? And particularly, since the topic here is about mental health and de-escalation, we're going to talk a little bit about who are you when it comes to handling conflict. So this next slide is a little bit busy, but fundamentally, what I just want you to pick out here is that we do know there are theories out there, like personality type assessments, relationship-based assessments, that help us understand that most of us have a dominant style of handling conflict. And so you can just look here for a second and maybe ask yourself, do you handle conflict in competing ways where you become so assertive that you kind of put yourself first and start to, I think of the competing person as more like a bulldozer. Once they get going, they're just very headstrong. This person might be or described as like a bulldog. Or are you a person that your natural tendency is to be more collaborative? You're looking for a win-win. You want both people to come out of the conflict equally satisfied. Are you more compromising, where everybody gives up a little and then together you both are maybe like half happy, but everybody's compromised? Are you a person that avoids? So an avoidant person tends to be both not open about how they're feeling, but also not very cooperative. So this might be like maybe a person that stonewalls with silence. Or are you a person that you're very, very accommodating and the argument or the conflict ends, but really it's more at your expense? And I also want to just add a caveat here that what you might find is that your dominant style depends on who we're talking about or the type of situation that we're talking about. But most people kind of come back to a common theme in what happens to them when they approach conflict. So ask yourself, what happens when someone approaches you with a problem or someone approaches you out of anger? What is your immediate response to that? And that might help you think a little bit about what type of style you have. Randalee, I saw a flash again. I'm excited.
You did. So I have a question. Is there one best recommendation for resolving conflict?
Oh, gosh. Okay. So I think that the short answer to that is no. And here's why. I will say that probably the best type of conflict resolution ensures that there's no, like violence or unethical behavior. We want healthy conflict resolution, but there are often different ways to get there. And I think this slide actually typifies that there might need to be different ways of approaching things because people bring different desires into the conversation, or people enter conflict for different reasons. So for instance, one person's hot button might be that they don't like to be disrespected, where another person's hot button might be that they don't like to feel that their opinion isn't valued or that they're being left out in some way. And so how we best resolve conflict is actually to try to best understand the person's needs and sort of work through a process to customize our response to what the individual person is bringing into the situation. So I wanted to make sure that I shared with you an academic perspective on conflict resolution styles, but I will tell you, I'm going to show you a slide that I made many years ago that I actually sort of prefer. Not that I'm better than the well-validated research that I just showed you, but I love this slide because I feel like people get it. Like people instantly tell me, oh, I'm the dog. Or people instantly tell me, oh, I lock horns. That's the first thing I do. Or folks say to me like, oh yeah, I give the silent treatment. I'm slamming doors. They understand instantly what that image on the couch depicts. And then I think that knot, what I hear consistently from people is that they understand that as the knot in their stomach when they are sometimes paralyzed by the conflict, so much so that they want to avoid it because it's so uncomfortable. Or Some people describe that knot as all those knotted thoughts of like, how do I work through this? But I think most of us can look at these images and sort of imagine ourselves as one of these pictures most of the time. You know, again, it could vary by situation, but most of us know, oh boy, if it's on, here's my go-to response. So we're going to transition now into the second half, where I wanted to spend a little bit more time, and that is again around engaging other people and kind of dealing with difficult situations. So I'm going to start again with a picture. Say a bunch of stuff, but I'm actually going to start with the picture first, because I think we've all felt like that. And if we're being honest, most people, no matter what your age, you probably felt that way today at some point. So it's not necessarily just little people that experience this, this overwhelming, I'm upset. No, you know, we're just sort of blocking things. And why is this? Okay, so a rule of thumb is just understanding that when we're upset, our thinking does not work as well. And so I often just like to help people understand, you know, remember how your brain is designed, that like back here is the part of you that controls, you know, like your breathing, the things you don't have to think about. And up here, this is the part of you that does a lot of the thinking. When we are very upset, the activity tends to go back here. It goes to what we sometimes call the reptilian brain, and up here it gets neglected. We do actually know, and there's a lot of data on this, that the more upset people get, the more that their brain is actually stimulated in those ways that don't promote problem solving. So I'm just going to point that out one more time. The more upset people get, the less capable of problem solving their brain is. Here's why this makes sense. If I touch the hot stove, you want your brain to be like, get off the stove. You don't even want your brain to have words. You want your brain to just yank your hand off the stove. Your brain is really designed to, when there is a threat, do stuff to protect you without you having to think about it. The challenge is sometimes when you get elevated and you start getting upset, that means that your body's in a state of discomfort. Your body is in a state of like threat and arousal. Remember, there's like this thinking stuff, but then there's all that other stuff. And so what happens to us is that our ability to really like think through things logically is deeply compromised. At the same time, our developmental age changes. Like, again, we know this, that people's functional IQ actually drops when they're upset. Their developmental stage tends to regress. People are much more likely to misread social information. So again, I want you to think about the human brain as this like amazingly powerful thing that protects you from a threat. When you're in an arousal state, this is why, for those of you, you know, you get upset and you think like, why are you looking at me like that? Or you might give like that eyebrow thing, you know, when you're upset. It's in part because the human body is meant to communicate like that in times of danger. But then you can imagine when really, you know, you're like fighting with your sibling about what TV show you're going to watch, how it's not as helpful to us, you know. The things that have helped us survive from an evolutionary standpoint sometimes get in the way when we're arguing over who gets to control the remote. So the other thing I would just add here is sometimes to remember that when people are elevated and these experiences and emotions are coming out, please remember that sometimes they're also not about the current situation. And where this is really important to understand is that if a person has had a traumatic experience, so they have experienced child abuse, they have experienced child neglect, they've had a sexual assault in their life, they have experienced intimate partner violence, they have been a person that's experienced over and over and over again structural experiences of racism. All of those things, actually, every traumatic experience that we have, it shapes our brain. So sometimes, you know, what we know is that for people that have had a lot of difficult experiences in their background, they're actually much more likely to get to this place faster. So understand if a person goes from 0 to 60 really quickly. Some of that may have to do with a lot of difficult things in their life. And all I can say is that once, for me, I work in behavioral health, but once I really learned how the brain works when people are upset, and once I really learned how a person's experience with trauma can shape that, it really changed my own response. For me, I can only speak for myself, how I have learned to work through de-escalating people is that I am able to understand very deeply that it's often not about me. It's about whatever's happening for that person at that moment. And then what that does is it helps me take it less personally. And I'm able to stay at a place where I'm problem solving versus like reacting myself. And that is often, for a lot of us, that's the trickiest part, is just learning how to observe what's happening without immediately getting pulled into it, but observe it first and determine a course of action versus just reacting to something in the moment. And that's where that stress inoculation can help. That's where that building up of resilience can help, because you have enough, sense of yourself and your coping and your ability to manage to go into a situation and just hang back before you get pulled into it too quickly. So, as I said at the beginning, the reality is, though, as we're talking about trying to have some of these conversations with people and work to de-escalate them, that sometimes, we might find it hard for a whole variety of reasons. Some people they might have a very negative attitude. I mean, you can imagine that for a person that feels all the time like everything that happens, somebody's out to get them, or every day they're exhausted, everything's overwhelming. They see, the glass it's not even half empty. There's no glass. People might lack perspective, right? So I can think of an example where I talked to someone once who was a male who had a sexual relationship with someone, and it resulted in a pregnancy, and the person blamed someone that was like completely outside of the circumstance, that it had nothing to do with that, but that was that person's perspective, right? And so that's sometimes where we have to understand, again, we can't control that. We can do what we can, but we ultimately cannot control whether or not we're able to shift a person's perspective. So all of this stuff about what we're going to do, we have to understand the other person is also bringing what they're bringing into the situation. Sometimes I also want to point out that people are not always self-aware of how they're coming across, right? So I often in these situations think about, the people that I've known in my life who sometimes I found it really hard to talk to them because they've been, to be honest, a little bit rough around the edges. And then they would sort of share with me that other people were really just too sensitive, but they just didn't get it. I would hear over and over and over again, like, oh, I'm having a hard time talking to this person. But that person experienced themselves as like, they're fine. And other people just are like too sensitive and not kind of getting that, like they even played a role in what was happening. So, remember, like all of us also go these places. So just like I can say, oh, well, remember the person that you're talking to may have no idea how they're coming across to you. We also have to be mature enough to say that sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we're coming across terribly, or we're being very rude or abrasive and not really realizing it, or we're not realizing that's how the other person is seeing us. And so we have to do something different if we want a functional outcome, really, whether we agree with it or not. So go in with a strategy, right? And so we've talked a lot about, in these difficult situations, starting first with a strategy of like, how do we take care of ourselves? And we're going to talk about some other things that we can do to set ourselves up for the best possible outcome in these tough situations. Randomly, I'm like, I think a little bit, I don't know, I see that thing, it's like a slot machine. I'm so excited. So do we have another question?
I did have another question for you. What should you do if you're with someone who seems like they have a mental illness or they are intoxicated?
Okay, so I think that's an important question, because when we think about conflict, I do want to share with you that people with mental illness are actually no more likely to be violent than the general population. That is so important to know. Although certainly people with certain types of mental illness, what we know is that people can find it scary when someone's like unpredictable, or they seem like they're not sharing our reality. When someone's intoxicated, it's also accurate that people, when they're intoxicated, sometimes do act out. Like, we also know that people with mental illness, when they're intoxicated, that is a situation where risk does go up. And any of us that have been around someone who's intoxicated, we know that those boundaries change. People are sort of disinhibited. So what I would suggest is kind of following through the things that we're going to talk about to try to calm the situation, but recognizing that you may need to more quickly reach out, like, to your security person, a police department, a crisis hotline. Like, here in Erie County, that would be our crisis services program. We may need to get others involved if we're in a situation where, remember, if we're trying to resolve a conflict and there's no way the other person can be rational, we might find ourselves hitting the limits of what we can do safely a lot sooner than if we're with a person that is able to engage us in a rational conversation. So thank you for that question. So one thing I would suggest is just remembering that helping the other person know what to expect from you often serves to prevent conflict before it even starts. So I've heard a lot in the pandemic about mask wearing, and I do just want to extend my sympathies to any person that has had to have some of these difficult conversations with people. Things like that, things like you need to have a mask in here. If you arrive more than 5 minutes late to work, your pay will be docked. No shirt, no shoes, no shirt, no service. Those types of things. Actually, it's way easier to post them, to educate people about it, to have as much clear stuff up front as possible, because then you have something to go back to and reiterate, versus when things are already heated, then trying to start a conversation about boundaries. I also want to advise people to know their trouble spots. So I know that we're in this context of this like leadership discussion. And so as leaders, I think it's important to think about your business, your industry, your department, your team. Understand what are like the, sometimes people call them pain points, like what are the places where more conflict is likely to happen? Is it long waits someplace? Is it that people are going to get negative outcomes? If you work in the court system, you have to be prepared for what happens if people hear something they don't want to hear. If you work in the hospital, how prepared are you to give bad news about someone's prognosis? In other environments, this might be performance evaluations or discipline, but there is definitely a certain wisdom to thinking through where your problem areas are and like planning for those. If you run into issues, another rule of thumb is the more that you can focus on the problem and not the person. We've all heard this. That's actually very helpful. And the ways that we do that, for instance, are to consistently talk about the issue. And for instance, avoid things that can seem like we're talking about the person. You need to lower your voice. Sounds very different than, I'd really like to help you. Is it okay if we sit down and talk about this like quietly together? There's completely different types of messages. So it's one thing to say, we're going to focus on the problem, not the person. It's another thing to do it. So, be thinking about, well, in the common problem areas that you face, how can you use language? How can you do behavior that really speaks to that problem solving focus versus anything that can feel blaming? I also, you can tell the type of music I like, check yourself before you wreck yourself. And a big important thing here when you are going into a situation where you're trying to resolve conflict is like, are you overreacting or are you underreacting? Both things can be problematic, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what is my strategy and like, what level should I be at? And I'll just say, as a leader, I definitely have gone into situations at DEF CON 5 and realized I should have been at DEF CON 1. And then I'm busy like cleaning up whatever I did that actually made the situation worse. So part of that strategy is also just like assessing, where are we? What have I seen before that looks like this, and like what worked? And then am I self-aware enough to know when my buttons are being pushed and what that looks like, and how to make sure that I'm keeping that from unduly influencing how I go about trying to be helpful. Modulate yourself, right? So think about the last time you were in a library and how, maybe everyone was quiet, and so you got quiet too. What we know is that human behavior is very contagious. So ask yourself, am I lowering my voice? Am I calm? Think about your body language. When we give someone eye contact, we might think it's respectful, but have we thought about like, what does it mean in this person's culture? Does the person actually experience me as like sort of staring at them? What's the appropriate way to look at them? Think about your body language. When we enter more intense situations, when we face a person square on, that's actually very threatening to the human body. Again, remember, if we're in conflict, that means the body is responding in that way. So a more relaxed stance, we're open, people can see our hands, we're slowed down. Those things actually make an incredible difference. It's incredible what that does. Think about your tone, your volume. Here again, I think many of us, if you've never had the opportunity to actually hear yourself or see yourself, it's invaluable. For those of you that are here with us tonight that want to be in a leadership position, I can't say enough about this. Being able to see yourself on camera, or just understanding how you use your tone and how you use your volume, how you use your body, is so important in communication. And then, ask yourself, are you really listening? So part of the strategy is also making sure you actually understand what the problem is. And so this goes to just making sure when you're greeting this other person who's elevated, that you've taken time to actually understand what the real issue is. And so I will say, over the course of my career, I have a lot of experience with this, that I might start a phone call with someone who's yelling and they're angry and they're saying like kind of unkind things to me. And it starts with, I think it's about this issue. And the more I listen, it's really about maybe the person didn't feel heard, or maybe they felt disrespected. They just needed someone to listen to them. And then what ends up happening is at the end of the call, they actually apologize to me. They're telling me how great I am. And it's a totally different type of experience, but I only got there because I really tried to, finally, I understood what the problem was, because the person had the opportunity to just keep talking a little bit about it. And I started hearing what the real issue was and responding to that instead of what the surface level issue was. So what's your inner dialogue sound like? I gave some samples here because I think this is really important. The strategies, all the stuff that we talked about with your body, but how you execute has to do with how you're talking to yourself to like kind of make yourself do these things in the moment when you're in a tough situation. So I will share with you my inner dialogue generally sounds like something in the top bullet point. For me, it's actually very important to remember what my goal is. So if my goal, for instance, is to help make the person feel better, I tell myself that and ask myself, well, is this helping the person to feel better? If my goal is to tell the person something that they don't want to hear, but do it in a way that helps them feel respected, I think about that. I'm always thinking about, what am I actually trying to accomplish? And then I work backwards, because it helps me not get sucked into that place where I just start to react. I'm sure other people have other types of self-talk. That's just what works for me. So I try to give, just some examples of like, what can you be telling yourself just to stay on track? So now that we've done this work, we're going to talk a little bit about like what are the signs of an impending crisis, and then we'll keep working through some of these basic skills. So many of you've seen these. Nonverbal signs of an impending crisis include the obvious things like the person is pacing or they're crying, or their fists are clenched. I want to call attention to a few that sometimes get missed. The first one is with pacing and restlessness. And why I want to call attention to that is because pacing, restlessness, rocking back and forth on your heels, when you are seeing that the person's body is going, what that also is telling you is that the person has a lot of energy. And so they may be more likely actually to act out. So it is more concerning if you're starting to see anger or you're seeing that type of negative affect, and the person is also moving a lot. That's something that you really want to pay attention to. The other thing that doesn't get a lot of attention is what you hear called the 1,000-mile stare. And so Randa Lee shared with us the question about what if a person seems like they have mental illness. Sometimes we see mental illness manifested as a person almost looking through us. They are there, but they're not really there. And so when we see that, that's often a sign that the person's intoxicated. They might be psychotic, so they're just not experiencing the same reality that we are. And that can be concerning because if the person is maybe they're perceiving there's a threat that's not there, and then they may respond to that because they just don't really understand what's happening. So that's one of those things that can tell us that maybe the person's not as like rational to engage in more rational problem solving. With verbal signs, what we actually know from crisis intervention work is that this tends to kind of follow this path where you can actually sort of predict that a person's more likely to act out physically if they act out verbally. And that can look a lot of different ways. At the sort of concerning but lower end of the spectrum is like being loud or sort of yelling at a person. At the higher end of the spectrum is if you start hearing threats, if you start hearing, people are like swearing at you, that tells us that they are starting to act out actually towards you, or they're acting out externally. But we also want to pay attention to just other ways that people's verbal communication tells us they're not doing okay. Like they can't hardly talk at all. And I don't know if any of you have ever had that where you've been so upset that you can't say anything because you'll start crying or you're afraid of what will come out. So when people are that overwhelmed that they can't talk, or they are, again, so maybe internally preoccupied that they're not talking, is their speech like super irrational? They're telling us that they're a prophet, or whatever we say, we just can't seem to get on the same page with problem solving. They're all over the place. Do they seem paranoid? So we want to just pay attention to the content too. So there's the tone, the volume, the pace, and then there's actually like, what's the content of what the person is saying? And again, anytime the person is swearing, threatening, our ears should prick up. And certainly if the person is being threatening, we would want to take action on that. We also want to be looking at, is the person's mood disrupted? So have they been depressed? Does their mood seem up? Do they seem impulsive? And so I talked a little bit about this already. Do they seem edgy or restless? Their body just can't slow down. Is their thinking distorted? We've touched on behavioral health and substance use, but the other things to pay attention to that are pretty predictive, actually the number one thing to predict aggressiveness is past aggressiveness. So what do you know about this person? Sometimes we come into a conflict already knowing that this person can be aggressive. And so that might change how we plan for this. And certainly sometimes if a person has a legal history, we might be aware that there's a little bit more risk in that situation. So I'm going to offer some just basic tips for sort of amplifying safety in this setting. The first is just dressing safely. So this could be everything from, if you're in a hospital setting, making sure that your clothes, for instance, fit the duty, right? We wouldn't want someone wearing flip-flops when they have to run down a hospital hallway to respond to a code. We want to be thinking about, if you drive outdoors, right, that you have things in your car to keep you warm if it's the winter. In this scenario, we want to be thinking about our safety with other people. So earrings, right, that's something someone could grab. A lanyard that holds our keys. If it doesn't tear away, that unfortunately could become a ligature. A scarf, things that we think are beautiful and decorative, just remember that, a coat that can be easily whipped up over our head. So it's important to customize this for your setting, but just to understand that even the basics of how we dress can increase the safety that we might be able to bring into our workplace. Think about how your workplace is laid out. So if you work in a very complicated layout of a workplace where people might be taking someone very far away from others, we need to think about that. We obviously can increase safety if we're seeing people, and especially if our more difficult circumstances happen around other people. Think about in your workplace, how are your spaces decorated or outfitted? So if it's public facing, are your pictures mounted to the wall in a way where it would actually be really difficult to tear them off? If you're at the customer service desk, is there a huge heavy stapler right there? I don't want to scare anyone. I will tell you, the best advice that I was ever given in this way actually came from a person who'd been in the Army, who said to me that his approach was to understand that everything could be defense and everything also could be a weapon. And so the best strategy, what he said, is you just need to go into your space and look at everything and ask yourself what could easily be grabbed, what's potentially dangerous, and just think that through. And also think through, where are your safety spaces? How do you get people out? So in a healthcare setting, for instance, if something scary is happening in the lobby, we might actually start to call people back, almost like they're going back to see their provider, but really we're just trying to get people away from a tricky situation. So thinking those things through are important. Understanding what are your options for communication? Can you use the buddy system? Do you have a code word? Thinking about that. Know what you're walking into. If you can get any upfront information about anything, even if it's something someone calls for the manager, just finding out, has anything helped this person so far? What's the person seem upset about? Just kind of knowing what you're walking into can definitely help you put together a better plan. And it's not always possible. It's worth trying to find out if you can find anything helpful. And then, of course, we've touched on these things about just understanding that your approach will be contagious for the other person. So in the workplace, something that I want to share is it is important to try to separate disputants and issues as quickly as you can. So strategies there would be things like, if you see that there's conflict between a family that came in, and if in your business it would make sense for you to kind of try to separate them, or have one person work with one group and another work with another, that can actually be super helpful. I would also encourage people to not wait. If your gut is telling you oh, I need to try to get the energy to change in this space, respond. Don't wait for it to kind of keep escalating. Call the police if you have to. So I could not possibly talk with people about de-escalation without talking about making sure that you call the police. Always if there's a weapon, always if there's a property damage issue. When it comes to things like upsetting calls and voicemails, what is your procedure for that? I can't decide that, and you probably won't decide it tonight. There should be a procedure of what happens, for instance, if someone's leaving unreasonable voicemails or many or threatening voicemails. Always, we should be documenting our concerns, because of course some of this does end up in the legal realm. More helpful things, not what I'm doing right now. Slow down, again, that pace, slowing down. Remember, people aren't thinking well. So giving short and simple answers, writing things down for people because their mind just isn't like, it's not working as well. Dimming the lights or the music. So, I think in really loud or chaotic environments, pulling someone in someplace where it's quieter can be helpful. Just allowing that ventilation. So remembering that if your goal, remember I'm back to like, what's your goal? If your goal is to resolve the conflict, pardon me, you may just want to remember that sometimes you can let a person tell you how unhappy they are without agreeing or disagreeing. You can just let them talk. It's a lot harder to do that though, if you go in with that belief that you somehow need to win or you somehow need to convince them. And so ask yourself, like, how important is that? In some situations, it's going to be important. 99% of the time, winning actually isn't important, and it's almost impossible to win. So letting the person talk, though, can often diffuse the situation. I would encourage most of the time to avoid saying that you understand. Pardon me. And part of that is for people with really difficult situations, they may reject that. I'm so sorry. And then finally, I do think in terms of wanting to be concrete, we also want to be specific. So helping the person understand what we will do, which can be really important when we're trying to resolve a specific conflict in our workplace, helping them understand when you'll contact them, what the next steps will be, and then following up. I also want to make sure that I encourage you to give people space. Everyone has heard, it's this much space, like an arm's length. Remember, when someone's upset, multiply by at least a half. Give people a little bit of extra room. Making people feel crowded is not particularly helpful. Finally, remember, we don't want people to be alone in situations of conflict if it's possible to avoid it. Try to avoid labeling negative emotions. I always try to say things like, this seems really important to you. I actually, when people yell at me, a lot of times I say, I'm so glad you're sharing this with me, which is not really what people are expecting. And it often, even that alone, often diffuses the situation because the person feels like I'm like welcoming the difficult conversation instead of telling them that it's a problem for me. And then finally, think about like, how can we be more solution focused? So again, this goes back to like, what's our goal? How do we help a person think about, thanks for sharing this with me. What can we do now? As quickly as we can like turn the conversation to, how can we resolve this together? I can't take away what's already happened, but how can I help us figure out how to move forward? Just as quickly as we can like put the person front facing, that's going to be super helpful to us. And it will almost immediately change the pace of the conversation if they're ready. And it starts to shift away from all that negativity. So as quickly as we can get to talking about solutions without the person feeling that their concerns have been minimized, the better. And so I know in the interest of time, we need to wrap it up. And I apologize for whatever's happening with my eyes and ears and throat here. But I want to end with just reminding that our theme tonight really has been, we can't control the wind, we can't control what blows our way, but we certainly can direct the sail, and we certainly can do the things that we can do to work to improve our mental health and also respond better to situations of conflict. So I just want to say thank you so much for letting me be here. And Randalee, thanks for being the most amazing host.
Thank you, Mandy. We really appreciate you being here. That was a lot of excellent information. I wanted to end today with just showing a slide briefly. This has, so wrong slide. Try one more time. I wanted to share this so that we can get your information. And I believe it's going to be in the comments as well. We'd like to have you fill out an evaluation if you have time. It only takes a couple of minutes. We would definitely like to see what your thoughts are. See if I can get this to the right slide. There we go. So right there is the link, and it's also should be in the comments as well. And then our final in the presentation series is the Small Business Resiliency Toolkit, Preparedness Plans and Human Resources. That will be with Gary Sullivan and Rachel. I'm not going to attempt to say her last name because I will mess it up. But that will be next Tuesday, February 2nd at 7 p.m. So I want to thank you again, Mandy. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you to all of our participants as well.